All right. Let's dive into some pretty hardcore stuff today.
Yeah.
Okay. Arrow penetration, specifically for Asian buffalo hunting. I know you sent me over that 2004 study update, and you know what's so cool about it?
Was that
It's that these researchers, they actually did real tissue testing on buffalo.
right?
Yeah. Not just like theory, but like real world results.
Mm.
Pretty cool, right?
Yeah, I think that that's really what makes this research so valuable. It moves beyond the hypothetical and it gives us insights into what actually works in the field when hunting such a formidable animal.
Exactly. And for this deep dive, we're going to be focusing specifically on the 2004 update part 2 section of the study. We're going to unpack some key takeaways about kinetic energy versus momentum, really dig into the concept of impulsive force, and touch on the fascinating topic of skip angles.
Right?
It's all about understanding, right, how these factors influence arrow performance. And not just for Asian buffalo, but for all big game animals.
For sure, yeah.
Okay, so let's start with the big question. Kinetic energy or momentum? What does this study say about which one is more important for penetration?
Well, I think the study challenges this common belief that kinetic energy is the be-all and end-all of penetration. It actually suggests that momentum might be a more reliable indicator, especially when you consider factors like arrow weight and the time of impulse.
Time of impulse.
Yeah.
Interesting. But I'll admit, physics isn't really my strong suit. Can you break that down for me a little bit?
Sure, yeah. So think of it this way. When an arrow hits its target, it's not just about the initial force of impact, right? It's also about how long that force is applied. And that duration, that's what we call the time of impulse.
So a heavier arrow, even if it's moving a bit slower, could potentially have a longer time of impulse than, say, a lighter, faster arrow.
Yeah, exactly. And the longer that arrow is in contact with the target, the more effectively it can transfer its energy and drive deeper.
So the study's kind of saying that heavier arrows, even with like slightly lower kinetic energy, can actually penetrate better.
Mm-hmm.
That's a bit counterintuitive to what a lot of hunters believe.
It is, and the researchers actually have a quote that really highlights this point. They say, all the information currently available from shots on real tissues indicates that when two arrows, identical in all aspects except their physical weight, hit identical tissues with equal amounts of force, the one deriving the greater amount of that force from the weight of the arrow will penetrate deeper.
Wow, they're really emphasizing the importance of arrow weight there.
Right.
So it's not just about kinetic energy, but also how that energy is delivered over time. And that's where momentum comes in, I guess.
Yeah, precisely. Momentum is basically a measure of an object's mass in motion. So a heavier arrow moving at the same speed as a lighter arrow is going to have more momentum.
Mhm.
And as this study suggests, momentum seems to play a crucial role in, determining an arrow's penetration potential.
So it's this combination of momentum and time of impulse that really makes a difference.
It's a complex interplay of factors, but the study strongly suggests that impact momentum is, how do I put it, is kind of the starting point, the place you want to start when it comes to predicting penetration.
Okay, so let's dig a little deeper into this impulsive force idea. How does it actually relate to arrow penetration?
Well, think of it like pushing a heavy object versus a light object. You need to apply more force over a longer period to get that heavy object moving.
Yeah, that makes sense. So are you saying that a heavier arrow, because it takes longer to decelerate upon impact, can actually generate more force over time?
That's a great way to put it, yeah. The heavier arrow, due to its inertia, it maintains that forward momentum for a longer period. So it results in a longer time of impulse, and this prolonged application of force, that's what leads to the deeper penetration.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get it, but there's got to be more to the story than just arrow weight, right? I mean, the study mentions shaft tests and skip angles too, which I'm guessing also play a role in penetration.
Oh, absolutely. While arrow weight and momentum are crucial, other factors like arrow design and shot placement, they also come into play. For example, the researchers tested different arrow shaft materials, and they found that a double shaft setup actually outperformed all other arrow types in terms of penetration.
A double shaft. That's interesting. I wouldn't have expected that. Do they explain why?
They theorized that the double shaft, due to its unique construction and weight distribution, may have had less flex upon impact, leading to less energy loss and more efficient penetration.
So even the design and construction of the arrow itself can significantly impact how well it penetrates.
It's a complex equation, like I said, right, with multiple variables. But the study makes it clear that focusing solely on kinetic energy without considering these other factors, it can lead to a limited understanding of arrow performance.
All right, this is all fascinating stuff. But before we move on to those skip angles, I want to make sure I'm clear on one thing. So you're saying that heavier arrows, even with slightly lower kinetic energy, can actually penetrate better because of their greater momentum and longer time of impulse.
Yeah.
But how does this translate to, like, real-world hunting scenarios? Does this apply to all big game animals, or is it specific to buffalo?
That's a great question. And the study suggests that these principles, they apply to all big game animals, not just buffalo. Remember, we're talking about fundamental physics here, right?
Yeah.
The concept of impulse of force and the importance of time of impulse, those are universal.
So whether you're hunting elk, moose, or even whitetail, a heavier arrow with good momentum, it could potentially outperform a lighter arrow with higher kinetic energy.
That's what the research suggests. Of course, there are always other factors to consider, like shot
Yeah.
placement, broadhead design, and the specific anatomy of the animal you're hunting. But understanding the role of momentum and time of impulse, that gives you a solid foundation for making informed decisions about your arrow setup.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's not just about chasing those high kinetic energy numbers, but about finding the right balance between kinetic energy, momentum, and those other factors that influence penetration.
Exactly. And speaking of other factors, let's talk about those skip angles you mentioned. The study actually did some pretty interesting ancillary tests on this, and the findings, they're particularly relevant for anyone hunting from an elevated shooting position.
Elevated shooting position, why is that?
Well, when you're shooting from a tree stand or any elevated position, the angle at which your arrow impacts the animal is going to be different than when you're shooting from ground level, right? And this angle of impact, it can have a significant effect on whether your broadhead penetrates cleanly or glances off bone.
Ah, I see. So if my arrow hits a rib at an angle, there's a chance it could deflect, even if I make a perfect shot placement.
That's the risk. And it's not just a problem with buffalo. The study actually emphasizes that most broadheads, regardless of their design, will skip when the impact angle to the bone is not 90 degrees. And when you think about the anatomy of most animals, ribs have those curved surfaces, which means that a perfect 90-degree impact is pretty rare.
So even if I do everything right, choose a heavy arrow with good momentum, make a perfect shot placement, my arrow could still deflect off a rib because of the angle of impact. That's a little unnerving.
It is something to be aware of, especially for those hunting from elevated positions. And that's where understanding these skip angles becomes crucial.
Okay, so what did the researchers find out about skip angles?
They tested a variety of broadhead designs at different angles to see how likely they were to skip off bone. And one of the key takeaways was that long, narrow broadheads tended to perform better at oblique angles than wider multi-blade broadheads.
So for hunters in tree stands or other elevated positions, a long, narrow broadhead might be a better choice.
The research certainly suggests that, yeah, these designs, they seem to be less prone to skipping even at those less than ideal impact angles.
Okay, that's good to know. But I'm also curious about the shaft test they conducted. You mentioned earlier that a double shaft setup outperformed all other arrow types. What other observations did they make about arrow shafts and their impact on penetration?
They actually had some interesting observations about the performance of different shaft materials. For example, they found that tapered hickory shafts consistently outperformed both parallel and barrel-tapered hickory shafts.
Really? The shape of the shaft made that much of a difference. I wouldn't have thought that something as subtle as a taper would have such a noticeable impact.
It's fascinating, isn't it? And the researchers actually made a note about this, suggesting that the tapered shafts might penetrate better due to a higher FOC.
FOC. Refresh my memory. What does that stand for again?
FOC stands for forward of center, and it refers to the balance point of the arrow. Basically, it's the percentage of the arrow's weight that's distributed forward of the center point. A higher FOC can improve arrow flight and stability, which can lead to more consistent penetration.
Ah, okay. So the tapered shafts, with their higher FOC, might have been more stable and therefore penetrated more effectively.
That's the theory. And the researchers even observed that the tapered shafts seem to have less flex upon impact, which could also contribute to better penetration.
So it's not just about the overall weight of the arrow, but also how that weight is distributed along the shaft.
Exactly. It's these seemingly small details that can make a big difference when it comes to arrow performance. And this study really highlights the need to consider all these factors, not just the kinetic energy numbers.
All right, so we've talked about the importance of momentum, time of impulse, skip angles, and even shaft design. But I have to ask, aside from the specific tests they conducted, did the researchers offer any general observations or insights about arrow impact force and penetration?
They did. And there's one comment that really stood out to me. They observed that the relationship between impact force and penetration depth is neither simple nor linear.
Okay, break that down for me. What do they mean by neither simple nor linear?
Basically, they're saying that there's no straightforward formula for predicting penetration based solely on the force with which an arrow hits its target. There are too many other variables at play, as we've been discussing.
So it's not as simple as more force equals more penetration.
Not at all. The study actually challenges this common assumption. They emphasize that factors like arrow momentum, shaft design, broadhead characteristics, and even the angle of impact, they all interact in complex ways to influence penetration depth.
So it's a more nuanced picture than many hunters might realize. It's not just about cranking up your bow's draw weight to achieve those sky-high kinetic energy numbers. You need to consider the whole system, the arrow, the broadhead, and how they all work together to transfer energy efficiently to the target.
Precisely. And that's one of the most valuable takeaways from this study. It encourages us to move beyond simplistic notions of arrow penetration and to embrace a more holistic understanding of how all these factors interact.
All right, this has been an incredibly eye-opening discussion so far. We've learned so much about the intricacies of arrow penetration and the factors that really matter when it comes to hunting success. But before we wrap up, there's one more thing I want to touch on. Remember that important tip you mentioned earlier, the one from the researchers about Asian buffalo behavior. I'm really curious to hear about that.
Oh yeah, the buffalo behavior tip. It's a subtle observation, but could be crucial. It could potentially save a hunter from a very dangerous situation.
Okay, I'm all ears. What did the researchers notice about these animals?
Well, they observed that an agitated Asian buffalo, one that might be about to charge, will often exhibit a very subtle head rocking motion, almost imperceptible. It'll raise one horn tip and then the other.
So it's a slow, almost unnoticeable head movement. That sounds like it'd be easy to miss, especially if you're, focused on making a shot.
Exactly. The researchers emphasize that this behavior, it is often very subtle, and it can easily go unnoticed unless you're specifically looking for it.
So if you see even the slightest hint of head rocking, that's a sign to be on high alert.
Absolutely. It's often the only warning sign you'll get before a charge. And those charges, well, they can be incredibly dangerous. Knowing this one subtle behavior could potentially make a huge difference in a hunting situation.
Wow, that's a valuable insight. It just goes to show that understanding animal behavior is just as important as understanding, the technical aspects of hunting.
I completely agree. It's all part of being a responsible and ethical hunter.
Well, this has been a really informative deep dive. We've learned so much about arrow penetration, from the importance of momentum and time of impulse to the intricacies of skip angles and shaft design. And we even got that crucial tip about Asian buffalo behavior. I feel like I've gained a whole new level of understanding about what it takes to make an ethical and effective shot.
It's been a pleasure diving into this research with you, and I hope our listeners have gained some valuable insights as well. It's clear that arrow penetration is a complex topic, and this study really encourages us to move beyond those simplistic assumptions and embrace a more holistic understanding of all the factors involved.
Absolutely. And perhaps a final thought for our listeners to ponder. Knowing the power and the sometimes unpredictable nature of Asian buffalo, what additional research or preparation would you undertake to ensure the most ethical and humane hunt possible?
That's a great question to leave our listeners with. It's a reminder that, learning never truly ends, especially when it comes to hunting responsibly.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and happy hunting.